Okay. Do you want to get started?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, this is one of those things where it's not like people will be behind if they show up in a few minutes. So,
Okay, let's see. Got one more person. And I'll set up sharing my screen. Let's see.
okay, while you're doing that, I can sort of introduce our group and what we're doing.
Okay.
Well, I'm part of David's group. We were referred to as DIAG before, but now we're known as the CCT data science team. And so generally our purpose at the University of Arizona is to enable researchers to better do their work using improved data management techniques through like developing scientific software and developing people's computational skills. And we're a resource for, well, I guess the entire university, but specifically for I have to remember the acronym for this, ALVSCE. So the division that includes the College of Ag and Life Sciences.
And the experiment station.
Yes.
And cooperative extension and vet med. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, we are, one of the things that we're using to help enable researchers are these monthly workshops. And so we're planning on having, our next one will be a follow-up to this one. We're going to dig more into how to actually use weather data in our analyses. And so that'll be in August. But we're also available to anyone, whatever topic you'd like to have taught that we could teach, we would love to teach it. Or if you're part of like a lab group or another group that could benefit from the type of skills we like to teach, we are basically available to help with people's sort of more individualized research challenges. So, yeah. And I don't think I said my name. I'm Kristina Riemer, and this is David LeBauer. So,
yeah. So I'm David LeBauer. Thanks, and thanks everybody for showing up. As Kristina was mentioning, our job is to enable folks in ALVSCE and more broadly to do data intensive research. In this workshop, we're trying to teach new skills. Weather data is data that is applicable in so many areas of research, and we've used it in so many different ways in our own research that it seemed to be a clear way in which we can help, show people what is available and open up some doors. Even in the last decade, it's amazing how much more types of climate and weather data have become available and how much easier it's gotten to use and explore. So with that, I'm going to give about a 30-minute, maybe less, mostly intro. I'll do a little bit of demonstrating, but then Kristina is going to do a few like examples of how to access different types of data in R. And then after that, we had a form that folks filled out last night or in the last, and today, that we can address some specific questions, or you can pose your particular questions in the chat and we'll try and get to that. But, so if you have a particular need, I need T-min and T-max for, this time period at this location, we can, hopefully it'll be clear after I'm done talking some of the places you can go to look, but we can actually make sure that you leave at the end of the day with the data that you need, or at least you're well on your way to getting access to it. So,
additionally, this is supposed to be sort of a hands-on and more of a conversation. So like at any time, especially if we start getting going and you have questions or want to bring up, I don't know, a resource about that's really awesome. This is supposed to be more of a back and forth. So yeah, feel free to contribute at any time.
Yep. And likewise, Kristina, try and feel free to interrupt and add things. So the learning objectives is really, as I was mentioning, I've got some data, I've been doing field work, or I want to learn more about what the environmental conditions were at this location. How can I figure out what the weather was or what it will be over the next 50 years, 100 years as a result of climate change, or over the next few months based on weather forecasts. So by the end of the day, today, hopefully you will be able to have a good idea of some certainly not exhaustively, but some of the climate and weather data that's available, how you can access the data using a variety of different methods, including R for reproducible analyses, but also by going into web graphical user interfaces, websites, and downloading it directly. And I'll also get into a little bit about some of the appropriate uses and limits of different types of these data, so that when you're writing it up or when you're using it, you understand what the caveats might be. So first, I want to differentiate between weather and climate. Weather is the day-to-day, hour-to-hour things that you observe in a particular location. So, you know, monsoon comes and you might get rain here and not there. These types of events that occur on short and medium timescales, that's the weather. And then the climate is, you know, the climate normal. So when they say that we've had a heat wave that is, you know, or we or we have a flood, it's a 1 in 100 year flood. It's saying, like, so what's the normal pattern? What are the normal events that usually occur, and how does this particular event compare to our kind of long range climate? Now, climate normals, you know, we recognize that as the climate changes over time, the normals also change. People refer to this as changing baseline. So normals are often given like assigned to a set of years. So in this case, over on the right, you have, like, for the 1981 to 2010, those are kind of the reference years, or what we're going to consider climate normals for that time. And on top of that, we can also look at trends, which we won't do today. We're mostly focusing on what data is available. But I just wanted to point out that these are the two classes of information that are useful. Another example of ways in which climate normals are used are when you have USDA growing zones, like what plants can we grow in this region, for example. Those are all based on what the normal trends are. There's also paleoclimate reconstructions, and they go back, you know, in some cases to, you know, millions of years, but I think there's useful paleoclimate reconstructions back many thousands of years, useful in different ways depending on the question. And then there's also these predictions. So many of us are familiar with the International Panel on Climate Change. They coordinate a lot of simulations to predict under different scenarios what the climate may look like in the future. And those are very useful if you wanted to look at the habitat of a particular species and how that will change over time. So to start with weather, this is kind of the like the gold standard to measure it at a particular location. On the left, I'm just showing, if you open up Weather Underground, you know, there's a number of different weather stations right around the campus, keeping track of different variables. A lot of them can be, or some standard variables that people collect are the amount of wind, the direction and the speed, how much energy is coming, how much solar energy is being coming out of the sky. There's air temperature, humidity, and pressure are useful. There you can attach a soil temperature gauge, a rain gauge, and then there's a little data logger, and that gets out to wherever you want it. So if you attach this to your house, you can put it right on the internet, and that's how Wonder Map exists. You know, the Weather Underground gets people to contribute their data. The cool thing about this is that you can get a basic model with a lot of these sensors and learn a lot about your site for $250. And I mean, the technology these days is great. Not that you won't have to do some quality assurance, but you can put it up there. But if you go out to your site and you put it up there, you still may want to know what has happened in the past. And so these won't cover that. Or you just might not have the time or energy to put it out, to put out a weather station, in which case you may want to use other sources of information. And a lot of our research sites, including, you know, the desert laboratory you can see on here, and I think somewhere maybe just a little bit off of here is the campus Ag Center. A lot of research sites have local weather stations, but here in Arizona, with all the topography, there can be a lot of what's called microclimate, and so there can be a lot of changes within a small amount of space. I like to look at these pages and see how things change just in small areas. One of the a lot of states, including Arizona, have what are called mesonets, which are networks of well curated and often long-range, long-term data sets where a lot of variables, weather variables, have been measured over time. They're checked and published by meteorologists. So here's a map of all of, oh, I pressed it twice. So here's a map of the different stations in the Arizona mesonet. And if I just open this up, so it's an old site. We're actually in the process of redoing this that will allow, among other things, for better, more automated access, but it's still, you know, a live data set. So I'm just clicking through a few pages here just to show you, you know, if you wanted to go to Tucson and get data for the Campus Ag Center, for example, that says, you know, where it is, exactly where the site is or where the current site is at the Campus Ag Center. It tells you a little bit of information about it. And you can get your, you know, hourly data, daily. You can get, you know, longer term reports. And then there's a number of derived values that aren't measured by the station, but that are calculated, like potential evapotranspiration is of interest, heat units, you know, how, like, cumulatively over the course of the season, how much heat is accumulating, also known as growing degree days. So that's ASMET. That's a great local resource, and a lot of states, as I was mentioning, have that resource as well. Let me let's see, why is this? Oh, there we go. So after weather stations, there's also a very valuable set of data called, that are reanalyses, and these are essentially interpolated data sets. And I want to point out two different kind of classes of these. One, I'll actually start with the second one, DayMet. So DayMet collects data from thousands and thousands of stations across North America, and they interpolate in space. They essentially use the station data and elevation data and some statistical modeling to interpolate in space down to a 1 kilometer grid for North America. And recently, I've been waiting for 2020 to be released, but recently they started releasing it every month, which is really fantastic. So now I can get last month, you know, April, May, today. Okay, so and you can look here. The other cool thing about DayMet is not only can you get this nice regular grid, but they also provide all of the source data. So all of the station data that goes into creating DayMet. So if instead of using ASMET, you wanted to go here and you wanted to get data from specific points, if it's close to where you are, that's a great source of data. And then, so another way in which reanalyses are done, so DayMet falls in the interpolated side more so, and then these other products like NAR, which is a North American Regional Reanalysis, and ERA5, which I can't say all the names of, but E means European, is it's a much more comprehensive integration of data sets. And not only it provides more data, so DayMet tells you what is happening at the surface. NAR and ERA5 can tell you information about what's happening throughout the atmosphere. They use a weather model to integrate data from weather stations, as well as radars, satellite, balloons, etc. So it pulls in a lot of different data sets and produces nice gridded data sets. Over here, I'm showing, it shows air temperature at 2 meters. As a quick aside, often people talk about air temperature, and that is, 2 meters is a pretty standard reference point for measuring air temperature. So what are some of the limitations of this? So this is a time when I pulled out data from a reanalysis product, and I tried to downscale it to hourly data using some simple algorithms. And then I compared it to what was actually observed. And so here you've got the red is the interpolated product, and the blue is the weather station. And you can see, I think, in particular, relative humidity, you don't get nearly the same range in the interpolated as the observed. In the case of crew incept, this is over a half of a degree grid. And so if you're imagining that we're in Tucson, for example, that could cover both Tucson and Mount Lemmon. And that's just a gridded product. So it's necessary to keep this type of information in mind. That's when something like day met at a kilometer grid is much more useful. But on the other hand, you see that we get it, it's pretty close. And for a lot of applications, it can be sufficient and useful, especially when there aren't any other options. So now to get into forecasts, briefly, we can look up weather forecasts on the left, and there's also climate forecasts. This type of information is available through, weather forecasts are available through a number of different sources I'll list later. Weather forecasts are pretty good these days on the scale of 7 to 10 days. They're not as good on longer time scales, but it is possible to get lower resolution kind of trends. So we might have seen, for example, we keep on getting updates on what the monsoon might look like. It was kind of, we don't really know. Now it's looking like it might be a little bit more rain than previously expected. But those are pretty rough. And then the climate forecasts, those are also model often at very lower, a lower spatial and temporal resolution, like monthly at 1 degree, 2 degree, keeps on getting better, higher resolution. But these are essentially where we get ideas about under which CO2 emission scenarios, where is it going to be wetter, where is it going to be drier. So here kind of for reference, but I'm not going to go through all of this, but I wanted to provide some, big picture on some of the more widely used data sets that are available. So we have the meteorological stations, then we have NAR, DayMet, Crew Inset, they're all reanalysis, and ERA5 are all reanalysis products. And we have down here, short-term weather forecasts. As I mentioned, on longer time scales, like when you get out to 7 weeks, it'll give it to you like these are going to be the monthly trends at a almost half degree grid, and it kind of relates to how certain they are. So it often doesn't make a lot of sense to provide high resolution information for low certainty events. ICMIP is actually, they downscale these climate projections, and that's often useful for things like crop models that require hourly or sub-daily data sets. And then TerraClimate's another data set that we'll talk about and look at in a little bit, that is, and rather than forecasting out what's going to, particular decades or years, it's going to say what would the climate look like, or what would the weather look like under different warming scenarios at +2 and +4 degrees Celsius warming relative to the current normals.
Well, and were you going to share the other lists that we had of different, so there's a few different lists that we found of weather and climate data sources, sort of like this one. That we can share too.
I put together something like here,
Okay.
and we can expand it and send it out when we're done. So, I mean, and the most comprehensive one is that I found was NCARD's Climate Data Guide. It's very comprehensive. Sometimes it can be hard to sort through what they are, but then like this user interface, the Climate Engine gives a lot of gives access to a lot of the key data sets. Okay, so now I'm going to transition somewhat quickly because I wanted to make people familiar with what NetCDF is, because it's a very useful tool, and it's one that's so widely used in the geosciences that when you encounter it, especially because it can be challenging to use, it's worthwhile to understand what it actually is. So NetCDF is a hierarchical data format, so you can have many dimensions, more than 3 dimensions, n dimensions. So you could have like, latitude, longitude, altitude, as well as time would be a common, set of 4 different dimensions that you would use. And so it represents it in a format. And once you start representing these data on a grid, you've got 10 variables on a 1 kilometer grid, the amount of data increases very rapidly. So it's an efficient way not only of storing the data, but also running some calculations on the data. Because you don't have to read it all into memory, and it's optimized for a lot of making some basic calculations. Another cool thing about NetCDF is, and I'll give a little demo next, is that you can treat a URL. Well, if it's on a particular type of server called a thread server, you can treat a URL like a file, so you can use it, you can subset it, you can do some summary analyses of it without actually having to download a large file. And when I say subset, it's like if you have a global weather product and you just want it for one location, you can just pull that out. So it's kind of like an online database, but it's also a file that you can pass around. If you've heard of HDF5, NetCDF is it provides a subset of the HDF5 features. I just wanted to make sure that people were aware that it's similar. But if you've heard of neither, then you don't need to know that. The other useful part about it is that it's self-describing, and there's a standard format for the data and metadata, and there's also a number of standard names for the dimensions and the variables called the climate forecast conventions. And having the standardized metadata, as we'll see in a second with the plotting, it means that you can create a plot and it's got everything's labeled as according to the content of the data. This is an example actually of a hyperspectral data cube, just showing that here's 3 different dimensions, X, Y, and wavelength. So it's also, in addition, well, in the geosciences for these types of data, I should have put up here that it's also used a lot in remote sensing. So now I want to go through just showing you how you might access some NetCDF data and begin to explore it in this tool called Panoply. So where was I when I did that? So I thought I gave myself a link. Well, I will go here. Let's see. So sorry, I'll just go down to Terra Climate. This is where I wanted to look. We can see what it looks like. So there's a number of different ways in which you can download this data set called Terra Climate. And one of them is you can download the subsets on threads. And this doesn't look nice. I mean, it doesn't look fancy, but it's very powerful. So I'm just going to dig down into this data catalog and look at some climate summaries.
Well, and so to back up a second, so Threads is a server, right? So it's basically like a place on the internet to store data. And so there are Threads servers for lots of different data sources besides this one, right?
Yeah. A lot of the data that you find in NetCDF format, a lot of the climate data, weather data, and satellite data will be available in this format, including DayMet. But when Kristina shows you some of the nice the R packages that will allow you to access the data, it essentially makes what we're about to do easier to do from within R. But this is showing you a little bit of the back end, because sometimes it's useful to see, to see all of the data that's available and understand what this looks like. So we're just going to look at some of the summaries, and you can see like this is Terra Climate under the 4 degrees C scenario, the T-min, and it doesn't have a year associated with it. Well, down here it has a range of time, but because these are climatologies, this will be a map of the U.S. I think that it's got monthly summaries. So I'm going to just copy this. So this is the catalog, the URL for the catalog. So I'll copy that. I'm going to open up this program called Panoply. And I would come in here and I would say, open up a remote catalog. And I put that there and I load it. And you can see I've actually just loaded it twice because I was practicing. But then, so now you can see like this right here where it says summaries, that's exactly like this. And I can open this up and we'll see the exact same files right there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the summaries, And you can see that there's a number of other URLs that we can look at. These it's hard to understand what all of these might be if you don't know what the acronyms are. So I'll show you a few of the useful ones. But first, I'm just going to double click this one. And the first thing it does is it quickly downloads the metadata. And the metadata says this is what the like the geospatial information, how this fits onto the Earth. And you've got this one-dimensional variable called latitude. So there's 4,320 of those, and longitude, time. So this is your 3 dimensions, and you've got one variable called t-min. And this is where a lot of additional nice metadata is. It gives you the units, describes the data, and tells you what its dimensions are, etc. And then you can, if you right-click this, you can create a plot. A georeference, and automatically identifies latitude and longitude because we've got this CRS variable, the information, the coordinate system. I'll create that. Now it's downloading this data set, and it'll generate a plot for us. Once it generates a plot, we can also look at the underlying data. And if we wanted to, we could export it as a CSV, but it will give you a warning that this data set that started at under 100 megabytes will be many gigabytes large if you print it out as a CSV file. So that's when you start to think about, well, do I want this very large CSV file, or this is the advantage of NetCDF, that I can subset what I need out of here. And while we're waiting for that, so the cool thing here is that it should just plot out the data that is here. And if it doesn't, well, as we're waiting for that, I'm going to poke in here and look at a few other things. So here, it provides you a little bit of a graphical user interface. So if you see there's all these different versions here. So the NetCDF subset, you can come in here and you can define a region that you want to download data from, the start and the end time. These dates are incorrect, but I think it's because a year is required. And what it does is it provides you this URL. And if I were to take this URL, let me just come up here, and I'm going to say I want it from 25 north to 20 south, and from negative 110 to 100. Then I can download this file, where I could copy this URL and use it in an R function like download file, or I can submit this and it will begin to download that subset. Oh, no variables requested. I want to request this variable. Okay, so yeah, you can have a lot of variables in there. So now I submitted that, and it should begin to download up there. In the meantime, sort of like I'm on a cooking show, here's our minimum temperature map that has appeared. And you can look under here at the array, which is pretty big, so it might freeze up, unfortunately. So this is downloading right now. Here's my map. It's not behaving nicely for me as I asked it to for my demo, but you get the idea. It's nice. It automatically gives you a grid. I mean, this thing, and it plots this out. One last thing is you can see it's got the monthly data set, so you could like scroll through. This is January through December, and it has just done what I asked it to do, but I forget what it was I asked it to do. So back to my presentation. Okay. There are other ways in which you can access NetCDF. This is not a comprehensive list, but I wanted to point some of these out, and they can all take these NetCDF URLs and act on them, whether they're on your local computer or remote. I also wanted to show you Google Earth Engine. Well, Google Earth Engine, you can use it in a, you can script your analyses in Google Earth Engine, and that's a very powerful tool. But I wanted to make you aware that there's this URL, I mean, there's this, this web interface called Climate Engine that gives you access to the data sets available in Google Earth. And here, you can see, like, you can choose what type, climate forecast, climate hydrology. It gives you all these different data sets, and within those data sets, it lets you choose different variables. You can either choose a point, or you can choose a bounding box for the data that you want, and then either get the map layer. So if you look here, you can either get the whole layer, the gridded data, or you can get the time series for a particular point from whichever of these data sets you want. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up rather than digging through Climate Engine. That's something that folks can do on their own as we go, and we can address questions that you may have. So we started compiling some different resources, and I think once we're done, we'll summarize them. We'll send them out when we make this available. But here's a list. There's some, both the data sets themselves, as well as like searches where you can go in and you can search for paleoclimate data. You can search a lot of different data sets here. The Climate Engine, here's a link, and then NOAA Climate Data online. It's also both a catalog and an interactive data explorer. And with that, I will hand it over to, well, first I'll just give time for questions, and then yeah, Kristina can do some demos. Then I will actually, before Kristina takes over, I'll just ask the question. Like, so can anybody or everybody, if you can type into the chat or raise your hand, or just turn off your mic and let me know which of those were the most interesting data sets that you might want to use.
Hi, everyone. This is Jeremy Weiss. For me, well, I use several of them, but I think digging more into the reanalysis data, the European reanalysis data, would be one of my interests in terms of elevating where I'm at right now with things.
Which I tried to figure out what ERA stands for, and I was not successful. So yeah, I don't know if it's European reanalysis analysis or something. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, that's another question. Has anyone here used any of the data sets that were in the presentation?
Apart from the Terra Climate, I think I've basically used all of them. I use ASMAT pretty heavily, the extension work that I do. Haven't been in the paleo realm for a number of years now. But yeah, I've worked with climate projection data, NetCDF form quite a fair bit in recent years. And like I said, I'd like to get more into the reanalysis data for a particular project area.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like maybe you should be teaching this workshop with us, actually. Because I have not used as many of these as sounds like you have. So that's great.
Are there
I'm here to learn. You're all doing great.
Are there any data sets that we miss that you think would be of particular interest, or?
Let me think. For historical weather records, there may be some NOAA NCEI, National Centers for Environmental Information, I believe is the acronym meaning there. There may be some ways to get at point locations, so station data, databases, whether or not there's a convenient R package for doing so.
I think
probably
NOAA.
is. Yeah, I think, Yeah, I haven't used it extensively, but that might be another good, yeah, that one there might be a good resource to add to your toolbox.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of them are like a compilation of individual station data. I know they have like buoy data, which I assume that is. And I guess, oh, I didn't think about this, but so we're mostly talking about terrestrial like environmental data here, because that's, I think, at least what I'm most familiar with. But imagine there's a whole set of this type of data for people working on like marine questions and things like that. And I don't know much about that because I've not done any work on that. But I imagine there's a whole another set of cool weather data sets for those kinds of questions.
I'll just add that right there.
Cool. So Charlotte asked in the chat, how do these data sets differ from those reconstructed from tree ring data? I don't know anything about, or not much specific information about, like, so it's climate that comes from tree ring data, I assume. And I don't really know anything about that.
So if we go here to the NOAA, this paleo data search, we can find data that's been reconstructed from tree ring data. And let's see, if we search.
I saw a tree ring option in the list of data types, I think.
Yeah, whoops. Let's see. So now it's selected. Yeah. So if we search here, and it'll take a few seconds. So how is it different? I can't honestly say that I know. I know that there is a great data set of, that's been produced for the Southwest in particular from tree ring data. But this gives you some data, all of which falls under tree ring. Yeah, I don't know if that. But like a lot of paleoclimate data sets, they combine a lot of different sources of information. I think I haven't really focused on any specific one so far because I'm least familiar with it, although my collaborators have been working on this for a while. But yeah, so just like some of the data sets like NAR and ERA5, they incorporate observational data from the present. These can be, these can go back longer term using the same type of models, the same type of climate models, and getting those models to match the tree ring data. And then using that type of interpolation to generate the longer term historical data sets.
Yes, there's a hand. Jeremy?
Yeah, just to add on to what David was saying, yeah, the temporal resolution is going to be different. A lot of these data sets are daily up to hourly in some cases, in the instance of Azimuth, for example. Whereas the tree rings are going to be seasonal at best and annual, most likely. As well as the information from the tree rings that you're trying to generate, whether it's a seasonal or annual precipitation signal or a seasonal or annual temperature signal. A lot of the reconstructions are going to be those two variables, and very rarely would it be something else. So those are some other differences too, to note, I think, when it comes to the tree ring data sets.
And I assume at least that the data derived from the tree ring data is probably validated with the more recent history, like weather station data and such. Yeah, they seem like they are kind of different use cases.
Another question from Charlotte is higher resolution climate data that goes back to the 1800s. So this is where I will. So there is a project, Paleon, and I can't remember exactly what they've done, but they have created some reconstructions, and the question is, well, essentially, like if you wanted to run, or the question that they're asking is about, plant demography and how plant communities change in their location over time. So they've done something but in order to run those models, you do need a higher resolution. And so essentially they've downscaled from this very coarse resolution to local, to a local higher resolution grid. I think even hourly now, that doesn't, it's not that they're saying that these hourly, reconstructions were anything like what was actually observed, but that they capture basically the current patterns mapped onto these historical, changes in climate. And so if I archive data package, I think that if we were digging around here, and if you want to send me an email, then I can actually help you figure out which ones you need. But I think that this would be where I would start. There or with these PIs.
I also just did some Googling for it, and apparently, well, at least so for the United States, this is specific, I think, to the United States, but it looks like that at military forts, they actually started collecting data in the early 1800s on weather. So they have a bunch of data for the 1800s from a bunch of different stations across the United States. I can share the link for what I'm looking at. It looks like they made this data available. Of course, I haven't had a chance to look into the details of it, but it's actually pretty interesting to think that there were weather stations effectively as far back as the 1800s. And it looks like it's, they have an interactive map, and it looks like they're pretty spread out. So could be an interesting resource. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
As the page that I was looking at, could be an interesting resource for some projects potentially. I mean, it looks like they're collecting the sort of basic stuff that we look for now: temperature, pressure, precipitation, wind.
Awesome.
Yeah, I don't know if someone's used that to like interpolate, this to create one of these more gridded data sets. And again, I mean, the higher the spatial or temporal resolution, like, then you maybe don't have as much certainty in that data like we were talking about before. So the further back you go, you can have higher resolution, maybe higher resolution spatial data, but it might not be perfectly accurate. So it's a cool find.
Yeah, I'll leave that up. I'll put that in our list of resources. Cool. So it comes under both. Okay.
Do folks have other questions or thoughts right now about any of this? These are some really good questions and really good comments. So.
Hey, I've got a question. So do any of these data sets also interpolate for like different elevations?
I think most of them probably include elevation within the model for the for each of the grids, I assume.
Yeah. That is
I think that's probably
essential.
important.
I mean, so when you're using a like a weather model, it's always using elevation, and in fact, it it's always running on multi-dimensional grids that have pressure instead of altitude. It uses pressure levels, but yeah, so that's always in there. And then, but for DayMet in particular, it's interesting because that's really the two key things that they use is the station data, the actual observations, and elevation, and from there, they're able to extrapolate these land, air temperature. You can kind of see here where the mountain ranges affect air temperature.
And I think DayMet and probably some of these others, actually, you can get elevation data in addition to the environmental data, which is the elevation data, I assume, goes into the models for interpolating the data. So. Yeah, it's a good question. Because I think Bradley, you said something about needing data from the Andes, right? Weather data.
Right. Yeah. So I want to collect data from a certain elevation range within the Andes.
Yeah. And so hopefully, I mean, if you end up using an interpolated data set, I mean, they would include the elevation there. But in addition, especially at higher elevations, I imagine, hopefully, if you can find actual weather stations that are near the sites that you're interested in because of those microclimates David talked about.
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping for, at least, because I don't think there are any weather stations like super close to my sites. So yeah, the microclimate problem is gonna have to be addressed in my paper, but yeah, we'll get to that.
That did remind me that, you know, a lot of the microclimate is driven by topography, and when I say elevation, what they're putting in there is what's called a digital elevation map, and so it's not just taking into account the elevation, but also the aspect and the slope.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess yeah, Kristina, did you want to go through some of the examples in R?
Yeah, sure. I can do that. Would be a
And
good time
again,
for that.
there were some specific requests. I think that so Bradley had a specific request for specific data. I don't know if you wanted to, if that would fit into one of your examples, and if not, I can, you know, show how we can walk through getting that out of the climate engine. And then I would also say, for if anybody else has specific requests based on what I just said, while Kristina is doing her walkthrough, I can look into you know, being able to figure out how to get those data.
I don't think in any of the demos that I have set up, I don't think any of them are global data, past global data. I think I have North American data. So yeah, actually that would be, I mean, I would like to see the Google Earth Engine stuff. So if you want to use that to
Okay.
poke around, I would think that would be good. So. Okay, but I'll run through some of these R examples for everyone. I can share my screen. Okay, and so as David mentioned during the presentation, there are a lot of ways to get this type of data, depending on what data you're looking for. And there can also be a lot of ways to then actually use it. And so obviously using R and all of the related ecosystem of packages is one approach, but there are a lot of other approaches to this. You can use command line programs, you can use Python. Panoply is an example of a good GUI for at least familiarizing yourself with a data set before you start using it. So this is using the R tools is not the end all be all, but it can be a good place to start, especially if you're already working with R. A lot of this process can be sort of automated using the tools in R. And also, I think David mentioned that a lot of these data sources, someone has built an R package that's a wrapper around the APIs for some of this weather data. And so it's made it much easier to pull down the data of interest to your use case without having to go into all the nitty gritty of details about the weather data and its structure. So I'm just going to walk through a few examples of some of the types of data we talked about. So we'll look at data from an AZ Met station. We'll pull in some DayMet data using a really awesome R package. I'll look at a little bit of forecasted climate data, and then we'll look at BioClim. So, and this is not really intended to be a follow along. I'm going to go through these kind of quickly, maybe do some copy and pasting of the code, because this isn't really about the coding. It's more about the coding as a tool for getting weather data. But all of the code for this that I'm going through is in the notes. So if you want to go back and do some of this yourself, the notes are there. And then obviously, if you have questions after the fact about some of these, feel free to contact us. Okay, so as David mentioned, or I think he went over this earlier, there's this website for these weather stations that are in Arizona. And I lost my notes. Where did they go? Okay, here we go. And so a lot of states have their own series of individual weather stations like this. And so unfortunately, it can take a little bit of like Googling and poking around and a little bit of detective work to figure out how data is sort of structured. And so this is one example of a data set where you have to do a little bit of sleuthing to figure out like how the data is formatted and what's available. So what I have done already is I went to the AC Met site, went to this Tucson, the Tucson station, and it has a bunch of description of stuff here. And then I downloaded, well, you can, if you click on one of these links, and I clicked on the 2020 daily data, it just pulls up basically a text format of all the data. And so I copied all of this and pasted into a text file and saved it on my computer already. And there are also, and I realized when we started this, that I should have done this way instead. But there are also tools in R that you can use to like basically plug in a URL like this one, and it'll download the data for you. And so I should have done that, but I didn't do that ahead of time. But that is another method for getting this data in a bit more systematic way, especially if you, for example, wanted like all of the years of data, you can use R and sort of standardize what the URL is that's being fed in order to pull down a lot of data at once, because this point and click method can be slow and error prone. But for the purposes of this example, that's what I did. So I downloaded the data, or I copied and pasted into a text file that data that we just saw. And so I have it saved already in this raw data folder on my computer. And so we can just read this in. Read it in unless it's got a full file path. Okay, so I read in this data that was in a comma separated format. And then if you open this up, you can see there are a bunch of columns of information with really not very descriptive column names. So of course, like I have no idea what X7.2 is supposed to stand for. And so I was able to figure that out though, because on the AZMet site, they have some metadata at these two links right here about what's contained within each of these files. And so I was able to, well, I clicked on this first one, and then there's this sort of interesting formatting that it took me a minute to figure out. But when you scroll down under the daily files, you can see they actually have a table here that tells you what is in each of the columns. And so with some of this data that's not necessarily in a very standardized format or in kind of an unusual format for compared to what you're looking for, you might have to poke around and find some metadata. But for example, I wanted to go in and I pulled this year of data, and I want to say, look at the air temperature, the maximum daily air temperature. So if I go back to R, I can go ahead and just plot the data from this weather station. And so from looking at that documentation, I know that in the X1 column, this is kind of small, sorry, I'm making this a little bigger. I figured out that the X1 column is the day of the year. And then this X16 column is the one that has that maximum daily temperature. So if I just want to plot those, I can do that in a very straightforward way. Okay. And so that's just a very little small toy example of how you can kind of pull out and use the weather data from an individual weather station. And then of course, if you wanted to say, for example, look at all the years in Tucson, or look at the data across a bunch of different sites in Arizona, you can use some of the same methods to pull this down and combine the data with the data that you've collected. Okay, so that's weather station data. The other, well, really big one, and the more common, I think probably more common format for most people will be these bigger interpolated gridded data sets that are oftentimes netcdf files, as David walked through. And so, as he said earlier, basically what these are is taking lots of different sources of weather data from individual stations and from other sources, and using models to combine all that data and then basically have estimates, I suppose, for different weather variables or climate variables for individual grids of a certain size. And a lot of times these weather data sets, they'll cover large areas. So some of the gridded data sets are global. And so that's really nice, especially if you're looking at places around the world. And then a lot of them are specific to North America. And so DayMet, which we talked about earlier, is an example of one of these, a North America gridded data set. And so there's the DayMet homepage. And so this is where, if you want to know what is included in DayMet, this is where you'd have to go and read through this. And so another thing that is difficult about using some of these bigger gridded data sets is that it can be hard to figure out if they have the information that you need in them. And you really have to go and read through some of the metadata and even sometimes actually download some data and look at it to see if it has what you need in it. So yeah, it pays to be patient with figuring out the right weather data for your question. But so yeah, DayMet covers North America. The grids are a kilometer by a kilometer, which is pretty fine resolution. And the data covers daily values from 1950 up through 2020 now, I think. Or maybe, did you mean May 2021?
Well, maybe it's April, because so maybe I think in May they released April, June they should release May.
Cool. That's awesome. That's one of the limitations we've had with DayMet, is that they weren't releasing data. They were only releasing data every year for the past year. So it's great they're releasing it on a monthly basis now. But so there is a great R package for working with DayMet data, and it's called DayMeter, because of course R packages, you have to just add a random R in there somewhere. And so they have a pretty nice README for how to go through, and you basically programmatically pull down DayMet data into R. And so this is a good resource for reading about this. And this is also on CRAN. So I'm just going to demonstrate a couple of the functions in DayMeter for pulling down data. And we'll first pull down some data for a single location using Tucson's latitude and longitude. Already installed the DayMeter package, so I'll just read in that library. Okay, and so the first, I'll just do some copy and pasting, make this a little faster. The first function in DayMet that you might use is the one for downloading individual location or individual coordinates weather data. And so you just input what you want. You input your latitude and longitude for your location of interest. You input the years that you want the data for. You call the site something, whatever you wanted. I called it Tucson here. And then you can specify whether or not, with this internal argument, you can specify whether you just want the data downloaded or if you want the data to be made immediately available into R. So either download the files or just reading it into R. Okay, so no, it's pretty fast because it's not a ton of data. And again, with having to sort of poke around with data and figure out its format once you've downloaded it, it's not always as straightforward as we'd like it to be immediately. You can see that what it gave us here is actually a list. And so there's some sort of metadata about what was downloaded. This is the stuff that I input. And then there's also the actual data, which is in this second nested list here. And so you can see the column names for the data that was provided. And in particular, the weather variables here, they have these sort of short versions of the names. And then the units for them are actually also included in the names of these columns. So slightly different format than like the AZMet data, for example. And so I'm just going to go ahead and pull out the data for the maximum temperature, the maximum daily temperature for 2010 and plot it really quick. Actually, okay, and I'm going to use dplyr, which if you are using R, dplyr is a great package for data cleaning. Okay, so I'm taking that whole entire DayMet data set and I'm pulling out just the data from 2010. So I pulled out that subsetted data frame, and then I'm pulling out data just for the year 2010. So now I have a new data frame, well, an actual data frame instead of a list. And just like before, I can plot the day of the year on the x-axis, and then I'm going to plot the Tmax on the y-axis. So it should hopefully look pretty similar to the previous plot. I previously plotted, I think, yeah, the maximum daily temperature from that Arizona, the AZ Met weather station. Okay, so this is now the day Met, the daily maximum temperature data. And so when you compare these two, they actually look pretty similar, which is what you kind of expect. And it's possible that the AZ Met weather station data went into that. I don't know what the date sources are for the day Met data. So it is possible that that was included here. So DayMet also has another similar function to this download DayMet, but it's one that you can use to download a bunch of sites. So if you have a bunch of sites around your, you have a bunch of field sites or locations, you can put that data into a CSV, and it can pull the data for a bunch of different latitudes and longitudes instead of just one. So in addition to this method of using DayMet, which pulls down the individual point data, you can also download the DayMet data as netcdf files. And so we'll do that just to start looking at some of these netcdf files. And so there's a similar function from DayMetter for doing that, which is this download DayMet tiles. And so just like before, you input the location that you're interested in. And I think what it does, if you just put in the single location, is that it pulls the grid that location is part of. And then I think you can actually specify having bigger chunks of, or more grids than just one. But this is just one for now. And this is going to. Okay, and so this is just going to be all the DayMet data for 1 year, or no, it's 2 years. It'll be 2010 and 2011. And this is, I'm only pulling down the precipitation variable from DayMet, because as you can see, so this takes a little bit longer because these raster data take up more space, are a little bit bigger than, for example, point data. And it is possible when working with raster data, if you start working with a lot of them, that it can end up getting to the point where like R can't read it in all at one time. And there are ways of dealing with that when you get to that point. Okay, so it's still downloading, and that's downloading in my local folder here. It's almost done. Okay. Okay, so what that function just did is it downloaded the DayMet data for those 2 years as these .nc files. So .nc is the file extension for netcdf. And I think there's another file extension for netcdfs besides .nc, but .nc is what I see most commonly.
Sometimes there's .nc4 to differentiate netcdf version 3 and netcdf version 4.
Okay, that's what I've seen before. Yeah, .nc4. But so we have these netcdf files downloaded now for DayMet, but what we need to do is read them back into R to actually be able to do stuff with them. And so one of the packages for working with this gridded data in R is called raster, because these .nc files are oftentimes referred to as rasters. So I'm going to use this raster library, and I'm going to read in the 2010 data from DayMet. Using this raster function. Let's see here, yeah, with the 2010 precipitation data. Okay, and I had some warning messages here, but did read in. These sorts of warning messages are worth looking into to make sure that nothing got messed up. But just like in Panoply, when we looked at the metadata for the netcdf file, we can do that also in R. So because that's one of the nice things about NetCDF files. Unlike flat files that really only have the data that are within them, NetCDF files have this like really nice sort of standardized set of metadata associated with, what are the variables on each of the different dimensions, and how many grids are there. There's a lot of information included here. So if you're starting to work with NetCDF files, it's really worth understanding what each of these different components of the raster metadata are. And I'm not going to go through those here because this isn't a spatial data thing. This is a spatial data workshop, but that is something else that we also have experience with. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to plot that raster just to look at it, and also to show how easy it is also to like look at this kind of data in R. Okay, so now we have our little grid and we have some values.
Kristina, are you showing your plots and your R console?
Yes.
I'm not seeing it. I'm just seeing the notes and not the R screen.
Yeah, sorry, I should have, I forgot. I mean,
Oh no, did I share the wrong screen? I didn't, did I? Oh gosh. Was I sharing? I wasn't sharing my RStudio window.
No.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Someone should have stopped me. I should have asked actually when I started sharing my screen. I shared the wrong screen because that's when I usually look at. Wow, that's really embarrassing. I'm sorry. I'll run through back some of that. Yeah, I shared the wrong screen. I'm so sorry about that. Okay, you can see my RStudio window now.
Yeah, I can see that now.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, there's some code here that I was typing and copying and pasting and no one could see it.
Yeah, I was following along just from the notes, but yeah, now I can see the R.
Okay, so you can see that there's this raster that's plotted here. I am so sorry about that. That was a big workshop snafu.
No worries.
And so, yeah, I plotted, this is the weather station data plot. And then the DayMet data for the Tucson location plot. And then this raster. Okay, well, given that, I'll stop here for a second and see if people have questions or if we want to talk about that. I think there might have been some things in the chat too. But... Oh, yes, people were messaging me. Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm sorry. I did not check the chat while I was doing this. I'm too confident. And yeah, again, this isn't meant to be like sort of a comprehensive introduction to any of this. It's just sort of like showing how you can access a lot of these different types of weather data sets in R, and how there are a lot of really nice tools for looking at these things. And this raster package in particular is really nice. And additionally, so here I just plotted the raster by itself, but you can also use ggplot to, for example, plot this raster onto like a map of Arizona. But that's something that takes a few more steps, and I figured was a little more in depth than we wanted to go into here. But it's definitely worth, once you get familiar with like ggplot tools for plotting, you can really do a lot with the spatial data. Sort of visualize all of this in a really nice way. Okay. Okay, and so the next thing, if no one has any questions right now, we are going to look at a nice R package, and in particular, look at some forecasted climate data. So this is data that the models that are used to predict into the future what the weather or the climate might be like. Oh, that means I had all these windows that I was showing that no one could see. Okay. But so in the notes, all of these different websites, the DayMet website, the DayBenner website, the AZ Met station website, all of that stuff is linked to in the notes too. So because you didn't see it when I pulled it up, you can look at them later on if you want. But yeah, so there's this there are several R packages that are good for, I don't have the link to that one. There are a handful of really good R packages that can be used to read into a bunch of different weather data sets. And so we'll look at one of them. This one's called Climate R. Okay, just to make sure you can see the Climate R GitHub page right now, right? Okay, thank you. And so, yeah, this is one of the nice ones. There's a bunch of others. I think David mentioned the R NOAA package earlier. So that's another one where you can access a lot of different data resources. And there's a third one that we were hoping to get to in this, but are not going to be able to, that's called Ingester. And so, yeah, this one's really nice. You can see there's this big list of different data sources, including DayMet. And then TerraClimate is another one we've talked about, that you can use this one R package to access. And so just to look really quickly at some forecasted weather data, we're going to look at this MACA data set. And so MACA, and I don't actually really, so there's a couple of these that have similar names, and I'm actually not really sure what the difference is between them. I imagine it has to do with how the weather data is forecasted. But basically what MACA does is it takes some of these climate models and it downscales the data so that you have a higher resolution predictions. So basically your grids are smaller. And so these come from the CMIP models, which is just this suite of climate models. Okay, and so this Climate R package, which we're going to use to read in a little bit of MACA data, is not on CRAN, so it has to be downloaded or installed from GitHub, but they have that in the documentation here. And additionally, there's this AOI package that it looks like the same person has developed, which is used for creating boundaries. So the first thing you do is you say, you know, I want all the data in this particular boundary, and then you use the Climater to actually download the data that's within that boundary. And so I'm going to read in those two packages really quickly, at AOI and then Climater. Okay, and then so in order to get MACA, the Climater function is called getMACA. So I'm just going to copy and paste that in here. So yeah, getMACA is the function from Climate R that's used to get MACA data. I think there's probably one function for each of the different data sets that's included in that package. And so I'm saying that I want to get the data for that boundary, that's the state of Arizona, using this model, which I think is the default one. And I'm just going to pull out again, the maximum temperature. And I think MACA is also daily data. Yes, it's daily data. You can specify which of the climate scenarios that you want the data for. So like how bad is the climate going to change? And then like before, you can get your start and end date. I probably should have started downloading this sooner because I think it takes a minute. Oh, no, that was fast. Okay, so this initial download of the data, I think this is actually another sort of weirdly formatted type list. What's a raster stack? But I think that I need to actually stack this data in order to plot it. And so this is one of those things with like raster data where it can be kind of in a finicky format, and you have to, there's documentation for how to get it into a plottable format in the Climater data or Climater documentation on that README. So I turn this in, I use the stack function from raster to transform this. And then I think plot should just be able to plot it. Okay. So this is the MACA data. I downloaded the data for 6 days in 2015 in June. And so this is just plotted all of that data. And so this is maximum temperature across the state of Arizona for those 6 days. You might notice that for temperature data, these seem weird. Does anyone have an idea of what is going on with these temperature values?
What do you mean by weird?
Well, they seem really big, right? Or what unit?
Oh,
do you think they're?
okay. The absolute values. They're probably in degrees Kelvin. So subtract 273.15, I believe, and you can get to degrees Celsius. And then, of course, you can also convert them to degrees Fahrenheit after that.
Okay, that is a really, really good guess. Because yeah, that seems like it might be in the right sort of ballpark. But it's actually, what?
I was just going to say, but you can see the topography, right? The rim country being, yellows and browns or oranges representing cooler temperatures, lower deserts, darker greens representing the warm temperatures. So
yeah,
it makes sense spatially relative to between locations.
Yeah, like the relative values make sense. So I will say that these aren't in Kelvin though. They are actually in Celsius. And the thing that is happening here is that with raster data like this, because it can get so big, they try to turn values into integers as much as possible. So like take decimals and turn them into integers. And so these values here actually are like need the decimal point moved over 1. So this 310 is actually a 31, but they wanted to be able to include decimals there. And so there's this correction, the scale factor correction that has to happen. And so this is something I've struggled before with weather data that's in raster format, because they're trying to get all the values into these integers as opposed to having decimals. And so the way I figured that out with this MACA data set here is that you can figure out what the scale factors are for each of these different data sets that are in Climater. And the way that I did that is that there's this param meta that's included in the Climater package. And I'm looking at the MACA version of it, and you can see that it has this. So this is a data frame for each of the different MACA variables, weather variables. And then one of the columns is a scale factor column. And so this actually tells you what you need, what conversion you need to apply to the value in order to get it to its actual value. So for example, these values in the 300s and the upper 200s actually need to be, you need to have that decimal moved 1 over to get the correct Celsius value. And that's something that's thrown me off before.
I'm sorry, Kristina, the units are K, so that would be Kelvin.
Oh, you are right.
And so there probably isn't a decimal. I know it exactly what you're talking about, because that decimal conversion or movement, that's tripped me up before numerous times. And by doing that, multiplying values by 10 or 100, getting rid of the decimal point values, so to speak, shrinks the file size down so they can ship it more easily.
Yeah, it helps.
And so you have to reconstitute it basically when you're analyzing it. But in this case,
but it's actually not here.
But it's not here, right? So
I just assumed I made a terrible assumption because I saw the scale factor, but then I didn't actually pay attention to units. So yeah.
Yeah, I think you're making a great point here though, which is dig into that metadata and make sure you know the units. Especially when it comes to the climate projections. I've seen them in degrees Kelvin, I've seen them in degrees Celsius. So I haven't seen them in degrees Fahrenheit, put it that way. So it always pays to check and know what you're working with.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and something that we won't get in here, but also can be really complicated is like, if you want to, making sure units are right. And then sometimes if you want to be converting or combining units into another type of variable, one of the things that we struggled with recently was calculating VPD, which is important for plants. And VPD is something that needs sub-daily values in order to calculate it from temperature and from pressure, I think. And so, we were using this data set and I realized we couldn't get VPD from it because it was daily values instead of sub-daily values. So a lot of these things can be like very tricky. Clearly, I just, misinterpreted some of the metadata here. So this is kind of maybe a good example of having to pay attention and not making too many assumptions about how these data are formatted and provided. And thank you for catching that, Jeremy. Okay. So I guess I can do bioclim. This will only take a few minutes. So the last type of data that we were going to talk about, or that I was going to read in an example of, is something that David talked about during the presentation, which is this like idea of climate data and then these climatological normal types of data. And so this is data that, as opposed to some of the weather data, which can be very precise and particular, you know, like what was the temperature on this day in this specific location. There are also these data sets that sort of are providing these more general pictures of what the climate or the weather is like at a particular location. And I have, at least in my work, I've seen a lot of these used for things like species distribution modeling, and can be used for some of these more general questions about like what habitats are appropriate for certain animals. And so the one that I'm a little bit familiar with is BioClim. And so BioClim is a set of these climatological normal data, but it's part of this bigger set of data that's called WorldClim, which I think has popped up on a couple of these lists of weather data sets. And so WorldClim is a great and interesting resource, and they have a bunch of different types of data. Unfortunately, their website is not the greatest. It can be a little hard to use. So WorldClim has historical data, and then also has future, so this predicted data. And then BioClim is another set of data that's included in WorldClim that has these sort of climatological normal types of data. And so what it provides here, as you can see in the metadata, is that it has all of these different variables included in it that are sort of supposed to give you an idea of the annual trends at a particular location. And so some of the things it has is like, you know, the hottest temperature of the warmest month of the year, the coldest temperature of the coldest month of the year. Yeah, there's a bunch of these different sort of aggregated variables. Okay, and they provide this in several different resolutions, spatial resolutions too. So I'll just show how to read in a little of this BioClim data. So this will be the last kind that we'll do. There's this function that's actually in the raster package, which we used earlier for plotting and reading in raster data. Within that is this function called get data, and you can use that to get, I don't know how many different data sets, but BioClim is, and WorldClim in general is one of the data sets that is included in the get data function. And so I'm going to fix this file path again. So, oh, I didn't like it. Okay, this was working earlier, I promise. This is the thing about demoing stuff. Okay, I think this will take a minute. So what get data here is doing, I'm downloading data from WorldClim, in particular BioClim. I'm trying to remember what the resolution, there's different resolutions, and I can't remember if this stands for 10 degrees. That seems too big. Can't remember. I don't think it says here. I would have to look up exactly what, there's a handful of resolutions that you can choose for downloading BioClim data. And so what this just did is it downloaded all the data as shape files. So this is how the BioClim data downloads into all these like different shape files. And there's a couple of files per each of the different BioClim variables. And so, and you can see that actually, if you look at how many layers there are in this BioClim all, which is where I downloaded the BioClim data, there's 19 of these different variables that are available. And I think you can also use unlist. It'll give some metadata about this. It's a raster once it's read into R like this. And so, yeah, you can get a bunch of different metadata, which includes the different values the different variables. And I think the last thing I was going to do with this is just plot one of them. And the first, I'm going to plot the first bioclim variable, which is the annual mean temperature. This takes a moment. And so bioclim, I don't think I mentioned this, but bioclim is a global set of data. And so you can see there's this map here now that's been plotted of the global data. Bioclim is about 1 kilometer. 1 kilometer grids
Yeah.
for that 10. I just can't remember what that 10 stands for. Okay. Okay, and so that is just
10 minutes.
Hmm?
I think the resolution equals 10 is for 10-minute resolution.
yes. Okay, I think that makes sense. I think that says that in the documentation. I think the documentation for this get data function isn't great because it's a general function used for a bunch of different data sets. So, okay. Okay, and I think that was all I had for demoing the data. With bioclim was the last one I was going to do. So yeah, that's just very, very fast run through of basically how to read in and start poking around some of these different weather data type sets. So that is all I had for the demo part. I don't know if people have questions about that, or thoughts. Or if you use some of these data sets, you probably are much more familiar with them than I am, because I just basically quickly found some stuff online for how to read these in. Okay, yeah, so 10 minutes is 1/6 of a degree. Okay, cool. Okay, that was in the world. So yeah, that's one thing about the WorldClim website that I feel like I ran into multiple times, is that like it's not really the greatest website ever, so it can be a little hard to find stuff. I don't know if you found that on one of these other data sets main pages. Yeah, they have this here. It's the same resolution for the historical data. Oh yeah, here.
Yeah, it's also in that get data documentation.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, that's really cool that you can get the CMEP5 projections from this get data function as well.
Yeah, so they have, I was trying not to use WorldClim for multiple things in the demo, but I know they have future climate data. And so you can read it in using the get data function.
But yeah, you can. I'll put up. That would do that.
Okay.
And it's for, with these future projections, there's many models that you choose from. Many RCP is representative climate pathway, which loosely map onto what had previously been emission scenarios, where they're simulating, what could we do if we the lowest one is if we do the best we can versus if we, business as usual. Yeah, so I wanted to, if you have a second, I can kind of show a little bit about getting this data from the Andes.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, one thing I'll say is that I was unable to figure out how to do it in R, but I did make some nice some progress toward that. I'll share my screen and I'll start with the progress that I made, because I think it will get us and what I didn't figure out is how to authenticate, how to create a login, get an API key, and then use it. So I didn't exactly figure out how to use it, but I think that it's a promising direction. So let me share my screen. So there's this there's a function, a package called ECMWFR. Well, I guess ECWMFR. This is the repository on GitHub.
That's the same group that developed the Daymeter package too.
Yeah, and
I think they're in Europe.
person, Keon Huffkins, I think is his name. He makes a lot of great R packages. And so I guess you have to register, get your API key. So that's what I didn't get through. Or I did, and then I don't know, maybe used the wrong email. Anyhow, I was fiddling around with it. But I think this should get you what you need in your, as far as, the highest quality or as good as it gets for data that you can get historical reanalysis data for a particular site in a particular location.
Is this data set global, or is it
Yeah,
specific to?
it's global.
Okay.
And so, but the other thing I did was I went to this climate engine, and I was able to get. So here's, I would have to do this once for each data set. But what I did, or I guess I could probably add more variables. Actually, variable one. Let's see if it implies that I should be able to get multiple variables here, but I haven't been able to. But what I did do was I got, oh, I see, if I do two variables, well, maybe I can get two variables. Okay, so with variable, well, let me start from the beginning at what I did. So you go from make map, which gets you out the raster data, to the make the graph. And what I wanted was was the time series. We just go with one variable, and I want a point. I guess I could do. I don't see how I can do multiple points, but I can actually put the coordinates in here. I think so. So Bradley gave me these values, and this is where I started with, was actually. So he gave me the value. So these values, which I translated, I hope correctly, into a decimal degrees by dividing the minutes by 60 and the whatever these are by 3600. So hopefully these two are the correct conversions. I would leave it to Bradley to check to make sure that these numbers make sense. For location 1 and location 2, and just type out location 2. And one thing to keep in mind is, for whatever reason, even though we often think about latitude and longitude, sometimes in geospatial data they reverse latitude and longitude. So and the other thing I did was I made it negative, since that's the convention when the longitude is to the west. Yeah, so here's for location 2 that Bradley was interested in, and well, let's see. I'll start with that would be the latitude down here, and then this is the longitude. And once I do that, it shows up here. So, does that look like that's the right place?
That looks like the right place, yeah.
Okay, so I go here, and then under climate and hydrology, I mean, so you wanted daily data, and I'm not familiar with all of these, so I don't know if what data is available for all of these, but I did know that ERA 5 would have it, and it's got mean temperature. I guess I could just click around and find out, but so mean temperature at 2 meters, and then you can set your custom date range. And what I did, instead of, I guess you said the month before, so it would be like, yeah, the month before, 1 month in 2017 and 1 in 2018, but I just decided so I could get it all at one go to just get 2 years worth of data. And 2018, let's go with 12:31. And so this will be the mean temperature. So that's the first step. And then I guess I could do this for both points at the same time. but I'll skip to at least that'll save you a few seconds. Get the time series, it processes it. And one of the reasons that this takes a long time is just the way the data is stored. Often meteorological data is stored in layers, so every day becomes a new layer. And so when you're pulling the data out, it's slow because you have to read in each day for a big region and pull out one point. It's possible to rearrange the data to make it faster for a particular location. Anyhow, so so going through this could be done, and if I had just kept on doing this while Kristina was talking, then I would probably have the data for both sites at this point available, and then you can use that and do your research. If you wanted to script it, like if you wanted to say, if you wanted to do the same analysis at many sites or for different times, then it's worthwhile to spend the time to automate the process and get the data into R. But either way, and so you can see that the where was it over here? And so you have this point data. R could, I'm sure in R you could get many variables at once and many sites at once. And there was a way in which I can download the data. No, so sorry. In lieu of downloading the data, I will do it the hard and manual way, and just that. And then I can go into R. There must be a nice, easy way to copy and to copy and paste table data into R. Mean temp location one. I'd probably give the location a better name than just location one. Well, yeah, so that I would remember what it is. But then I would go over here and say X is, or mean temperature is read the lim. What did I just do with that data? Let's see, where is this located? Oh, it's in a different folder. There we go. And the delimiter values in each line are separated by this character. Sep equals, I think that's all that is just one of these space. It's space delimited. The reason I copied and pasted it is because maybe it's a tab delimited, and I didn't like that at all. So
There were some headers. Is it angry
yeah.
about the headers?
That's a good point. Header skip equals 7. Header equals false, and then call names equals date. T. Data equals. I probably would, it's probably better not to name your data frame the same as one of the variables. Sequence default. What's going on? Why? This is probably gonna be more, it's always complicated to make sure that your dates work.
Yeah, a lot of the data sets that we looked at earlier have year and day of year. And then for things like ggplot, it's good to turn those into the dates. Makes it easier to work with. There's always a lot of cleaning with data like this.
Yeah. So why didn't that work? So There we go. It let me off the hook. Okay, so that's yeah, one way of getting it through the GUI. And sorry, I didn't get the the way to do it automatically within R. I also found out that there's a package called R Google Earth Engine, but that is essentially an R interface to a Python library. So you have to install Python and the library. And I didn't want to go through all of that. In both cases, you need to have your login name and your API key or password. Both of those. Yeah, I saw. I mean, there were some other requests, but many of them weren't nearly as specific as what Bradley provided. And Bradley, I'd be happy to dig around, or if you want to start with that and then dig in some and come back and ask questions, and I'd be happy to help answer questions.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I can use exactly what you did and just do a little bit of subsetting and get what I need. So that's great. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah. Are there any other questions or examples folks have? I did just find out something else. It's kind of cool, which is that I just show this Google Earth Engine. So if we were looking at this data that came out, and this is what. So when I selected this and said get time series, it actually starts by just showing you the time series of the data that you've selected. And then you can click here to download, and you can download it as a CSV or an Excel file, as well as an image. And I don't know, what does this link do? This link, I could actually send this out and get y'all. Bradley could maybe start with that. I can do the same thing for this other mentee.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Okay, hopefully it'll, oh yeah, it's got the degrees there. I mean, the location there.
Well, and so I have mostly worked in R with this type of data. I don't know if anyone here has used Python or other programming languages. I don't know if it's easier or more difficult. I mean, it's all kind of difficult, but I imagine Python probably has some modules for working with some of these data sets. I just don't know if it's as extensive as the R ecosystem.
I think for working with NetCDF data, there's a larger ecosystem of Python tools. Just my little bit of digging around.
Makes sense. Also, there's some command line tools, right? Like NCO, and we've used something else before too. So
yeah. So we got a question for Climate Engine, and I can chat about NCO in a second because it is pretty cool. So what are the data sources for Climate Engine? So Climate Engine is an interface to Google Earth Engine, so powered by Google Earth Engine. And if we go, so that's a great point, because if I was providing this data in an ideal world, I would make sure that Okay, so it says data source, ERA5, daily data set. So it does tell you where the data source is. It doesn't say what the citation is, but okay, here we go. So Kristina pointed out data.
They have a data page, but I'm not sure if it included everything that was in that drop-down menu. It seemed like there was more in the drop-down menu than is listed on this page, this data page.
Yeah, and so it's possible that this hasn't been updated since maybe it hasn't been updated, but if you like, Google Earth Engine has its own data page, and so maybe it's like they've been adding data to Google Earth Engine that appears there, but doesn't they haven't like updated that documentation. But so if we look at the climate, see, maybe it's not even listed here. Filter list of data set, ERA5, daily aggregates. Here we go. It gives you your citation information and all. So I mean, this is where I would go.
You're not sharing your screen.
Oh, I'm
If you-
sorry.
It's okay.
You
didn't do it as long as I did it. So. The wrong screen.
Thanks for being quicker than I am to do it. So I essentially went down here and I was like, oh, let's go to Google Earth Engine and then figure out where the data is. Ready to use data sets. Go here, see all the data sets, and then we can just type in ERA5. Yeah, and as you can see, there's actually just like an enormous amount of additional data that you can look at. So just right here, it says this is a citation that you can use. But you know, if you go into Climate Engine and we look at like the type, so remote sensing, now you have access to all of these different satellite data sets. Like, so you can come up with time series of evaporative stress index or other derived products from let's see, from here. Let's see what we got from Modus. I haven't looked at any of these, but you know, you've got NDVI over time, etc. So it's pretty cool to be able to look at these. I mean, access all the data in this way, and that our Google Earth Engine. One of the nice things about here is that it makes it easier to look at what you're looking for, and then if you wanted to automate it, script it, or extend your analysis, then you know what you're looking for, and it's easier to implement in R or Python, or you can go into the Google Earth Engine. It has a.
I was going to say, what's the benefit of using? So this Climate Engine's built on Google Earth Engine, right?
Yeah.
What's the benefit of using it instead of directly using Google Earth Engine? Because it's just specifically the climate data sets. Maybe it's a little.
No, well, I think that it's like Google Earth Engine. I don't know that it's not built as much for like subsetting the data and downloading it. The nice thing about Google Earth Engine is if you wanted to use a very large data set, you can go into the cloud and compute on all of the data in the cloud. So you can, you know, take the mean NDVI, divide it by some climate variable, or however, you know, you wanted to do. I don't know. I'm not that familiar with everything that Google Earth Engine can do, but these are, I guess, yeah, what the code would look like. And let's see, opening code editor. Let's see, that's cool. You sign into Earth Engine and you can start coding. Yeah, there's a lot of demos and tutorials for Earth Engine. Okay. I have another call at 5. Well, that's my time here on the East Coast. I meant at 4. So I'll step off in a minute or two. But thank you everybody for attending. I also wanted to point out we have office hours, so you can schedule meetings with us individually, but we also generally show up at office hours. Somebody in the group is always there and they can find us. But Tuesdays from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. There are people from our group ready to answer questions about this and other topics.
And so there's a page on our website. I just shared it for our office hours. It has the link to the Gatherton for it. So yeah, thank you everyone for showing up. Hopefully this is useful. It was fun to prepare for it. So yeah.
Thanks
use
for
a lot
organizing
more.
it, Kristina.
Yeah, probably use a lot more stuff like this, things that everyone's doing but don't really talk about too much. So
Yeah, I could use more things like this. Thank you both for helping me through that.
Awesome.
definitely, well, it was mostly David. Oh, PowerPoint presentation is included in the notes.
Yeah.
The link to it is in the notes. David will need to make sure that it is accessible to everyone.
I think it is. I'll give a link right here.
Okay.
Hopefully that'll
Yeah.
work. I'm
That's awesome.
gonna sign off. But thanks
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.
Have a good rest of your Wednesday.